In this video, I'm going to be talking about one of the favorite tools in my sewing corner, my sewing library. So why do I have all these books? And guess what? I actually have more. Let me tell you why. So I actually did not grow up sewing. I had one sewing class in junior high where I made one shirt and one skirt, and pretty much that was it up until just a few years ago. Now, although my mother sewed many of my clothes growing up, she never taught me to sew. So this has pretty much been a new skill for me. So when I decided I wanted to learn to sew, I did what would be standard. I went to the bookstore and I picked up a few books on learning to sew. And I started going through them and got a few patterns, and these books actually did help me get started. But as I started looking at more and more books, trying to figure out some problems I was having and trying to understand what it was they were asking me, I made a discovery. And that discovery was vintage sewing books. Let me explain to you why I have an absolute adoration of vintage sewing books and why I think every sewing space should have one or two. So the first thing is these modern books are so much smaller than the vintage sewing books, which some of them are really fat. But the reason I found out is there's so much less information in here. They've really watered down a lot of the sewing techniques and skills. So granted, they've added a lot of color pictures. So they're really, I think, expecting you to read some of the information and then see the pictures to see what they're doing. That's not always really, it doesn't really explain it really well. Sometimes you can kind of get the idea from that in the pictures and you're like, okay, I think I know what to do, and you sort of mess around with it and you get it. So these are pretty much watered down versions of what they used to have in sewing books. Probably a lot of the reason is that we don't do a lot of this sewing anymore like we used to on a daily basis. I mean, back in the day, I think a sewing machine and sewing for women was no different than learning to boil an egg or something. It was just something everybody did. So they had a lot of really in-depth information about sewing. When you look at these older books, now this is a Singer sewing book from 1954. It was actually my first vintage sewing book, and I happened to across it, and I got it because I thought the picture was really cute, and I said, oh, this will be a nice little display in my sewing room, because I have, these modern books that are telling me what it is I need to know. And then I started going through it, and I was absolutely astounded by, you could just tell just from here. Look at the depth of information on this page versus what you're getting in like a modern sewing book. Granted, these have a lot of great pictures, but look at the actual like explanations and written information. It's just they explain everything so well, and they don't just tell you what to do. A lot of these vintage sewing books tell you why. Why is so important as you're going along and you might be having a problem, or you're thinking to yourself, I don't understand why I'm doing this step or how it's going to fit in with the finished project. This amount of information explains to you why in a lot of places and a lot of detail, so you understand what you're doing before you get to that next step and you're going, aha, now I wished I had done this differently or followed this a little better because it fits better later on. But the lack of pictures really is made up by just the sheer amount of information. And I really like in these older books, they also give you information about setting up your sewing space. It talks about your sewing room as being a very important tool just in itself. A room of her own. Talks about making space for laying out patterns and for sewing and for room management, and why those things are important. It does have some black and white pictures, show you some different ideas of how to achieve it in different spaces if you're in a tiny space or a larger space. But it's just limitless. And they do have pictures. They have pictures for the important things, which is the lengthwise grain and crosswise grain and blah, blah, blah. But just, page after page, it's like a textbook of so much information. tells you exactly how to, now you can get this in a modern book too, how to take your measurements and where to take them, but this explains why. Why do you take measurements that way? Knowing a little bit more about your figure and so on and so forth. I really, really, really was absolutely impressed by this. So when I started going through this, I started understanding sewing a little bit more. And then I started kind of looking around at some other books. And I'm going to show you some of my finds and why I like them. So that was my Singer book. The next set of books I bought were these, the Vogue sewing book and the Vogue sewing book of fitting, adjustments, and alterations. Now, this Vogue sewing book is from 1973, and this one is from 72, or it could be the reverse. But these are early 70s books. Look how thick this book is. I can't even begin to tell you the information in this book. It's just huge, huge, huge amounts of information in this book. This has been more of like my reference books. This book is nice because this book includes measuring for men, which I haven't found in some of my other books, which is kind of a nice addition. The actual earlier edition of this book from the 60s, I believe, does not have the measuring for men. I have that one too. Let me just show you just some of these. You can see there's drawings in here. So they do use drawings to explain things. And you might think, oh, well, some of this information may not apply. It does. Just because the pictures are a little bit older, the information is still absolutely valid. Here it shows you drawn pictures on waistlines and so on and so forth. But again, this has just been an absolute astounding wealth of information in this book. Love this. It talks about how you lay down on plaids, how you lay down your patterns on different types of fabric, which is nice. There's a whole section here on adjusting a little bit, bust adjustments and back and hip and waist, but it goes a little bit into that detail. The book that goes with it, that really goes into detail on fitting adjustments, it's a little bit smaller, but it kind of goes together hand in hand. And this one is really in detail about doing all the fittings. Something they used to do a lot of back then, which now we might buy a commercial pattern and we just make it how it is and wear it that way. But they were really into making these things fit so much nicer back there. And there's a whole section in here on proper pressing when you're sewing, which is really nice. I found this one at a thrift store. This is my McCall sewing book, 1968 on this book. Now, this has got a lot of very similar information that we've already seen. So really the reason I have it isn't because this is so different, but I have found that even amongst some of these vintage books, some sections are explained better in one book than in another. So to give an example, let me just tell you. It's like this one is for waistlines. So this book, and I'm not saying this is true in this book, I'm just making up an example out of like nowhere. So this book might have this information on waistlines and it explains it and you're like, I kind of get it, but the waistline explanation in this book was so much better. So I would mark in my little, I keep a little booklet, so I keep track of stuff like this. This book I would write, this is the one I want to go to if I'm doing skirts or pants, and I'm really fussing with the waistline. This book, however, might have a really good section on, I don't know, I'm trying to kind of come up with something, maybe collars. So maybe how we do collars in this book is explained a lot better than what I was understanding in this book. Or perhaps this book talks about collars a little bit better. So I would say my Singer sewing book is where I want to go to if I need to see some pictures or better information on collars. So I do have several books which seem to be very similar, but some things are explained a little better in others, which is why I do have some of these. And I don't just go out and buy every vintage sewing book I find. I really take the time to go through them and see if that book is worth having in my library. And I live in a small space, so in order to be in my library, it has to have relevant information that I don't have in some other book. This is another one. It's the Better Homes and Gardens book, and I don't remember the year on this. Let me look at that cute picture. Let me look this up. This is 1961. Now, I remember this book had some really good information on alterations. tailoring. This had a really good alteration section, and I really kind of liked that. I probably could have done without this book. I have enough alteration information in another book, but this one was only $1.99, so I did pick it up. But there's the Better Homes and Garden one. This is the only book I have that has a smell. When I open it up, I smell that book. It smells a little musty. The rest of mine do not. So some of my other fun favorites, I'll show you. This one. Now this is How to Make Clothes That Fit and Flatter. This is by Adele P. Margolis, and I've probably butchered that name, but I actually love this particular author. This is 1969, missing its jacket, but I don't care. This book has got some really good specialized information on how to take a pattern, commercial or one you've drafted yourself, and really like tailor it down to the nitty gritty to fit yourself. And like I said, that was something they really used to do well back in the day when clothes were still cheaper to create than they were to buy pre-made. Gives you all this information on if you're having problems with it bunching here or here, how to go about fixing that. This book was really, really nice. I have another book by Adele, The Dressmaker's or the Dressmaking Book, that's what it is. And this one is from 1967. This book's kind of fun. Has some really good information. And this book also goes into, had a really good section on darts. So I have it marked in here. And the way they explain it and go about doing darts, I really liked. Here's a good one for talking about shrinkage. I have this marked too. Shrinkage control. So I have that one particularly marked there. I try to mark so I know what it is I liked about this. Now, this book, How to Design Your Own Dress Patterns, I have to admit, I bought it because I really liked the cover and because it's another Adele Margolis book, and I have liked her previous books that I have. But the cover was so stinking cute, I bought it for that, so there's a little truth telling there. But this does talk a lot about patterns. Now, when I first got it, I thought this is all about drafting your own patterns. It does show how to create patterns from clothing that you already have that might be your favorite clothing, which is like way cool. So if I have that favorite shirt of mine, don't have a pattern for it, I bought it. This book will help you to go ahead and use that to create your own pattern. But as I was reading through this book, I did discover that this also talks about altering and creating off of a commercial pattern. So that was a nice little unexpected little tidbit there. Here's a section on collars, buttons, bows, and pockets aplenty. Now, this particular author, Adele Margolis, she writes in a real nice way. And what I mean by that is I actually have just been reading her books straight through like a novel. Not only am I picking up a lot of information, but she's a really enjoyable and smooth read. I really liked this. And I did pick up a lot of really good information that I wouldn't have otherwise had on patterns and fits. Now, this book I picked up, this is really old. This is from the excuse me for the camera move, the Women's Institute Library of Dressmaking. This book is from 1923. I don't usually pick up books of that age because the styles and certain things they did aren't really as relevant to today, although you could just adjust them. But what I really liked about this book is that, and this is volume 1, so volume 1 goes into textiles, laces, findings, mending, household sewing, and definitions. So there's a whole group of volumes in here, and each volume focuses on something specific. I liked this one because this one talks, it's got a little history on the development of textiles. So if you're interested in the history of fashion, that's really kind of fun. I did read that, but it has all these chapters that specifically talk about certain types of fabric, and that information hasn't really changed much. This talks about like cotton, and there's this whole section, I mean, just all this information on cotton and learning a little bit more about that type of fabric. And then there's wool and lace and silk, and it's really, really nice to have all of those things. Here's a whole section on lace. I don't do much with lace, but I have this marked, and this is why this book has earned a good place in my library. This book has a really awesome section on mending. Mending is something we've sort of gotten away from. We just sort of toss our clothes and we don't really mend them. But if you're taking the time to either alter your pre-existing clothes or creating and sewing your own garments, you're going to want to mend them because you don't want to throw away something you put so much time into. And this chapter goes into all these just things that were probably just basic at the time, but things, I don't know, I was never taught, how to do these things and how to use some of these tools and just the best way to do these things, darning and patching, mending tissues, even how to patch or mend a sock, which is probably something I wouldn't do. But shirts and pants and skirts and pockets and buttons, even like mending lace. The mending section is just amazing. And it also has a section on household sewing, which is kind of fun if you want to make your own curtains and such. But for me, I really liked the idea of making my own table linens. So it's got a section in here for making table linens. So for that purpose, this has earned a spot in my library. Here's another book, the New Encyclopedia of Modern Sewing. This one is from 1949. And this one was awesome for me because not only does this one have really cool little pictures, I mean, just look how cute those illustrations are, seriously. But this one had, where I have something marked here, a nice section on useful kitchen accessories. Now, what they considered useful kitchen accessories in 1949 meant pot holders and things like that. So there's this whole section on pot holders and bias finishing for making around the pot holders, double oven mitts, which we think, I always thought they were kind of some sort of a new thing. It's not. The ones where you slip your hands into both sides, not new. It's right there. Just on like aprons, and there's some patterns for making your own aprons and how to pin things properly. Mother and daughter aprons, isn't that cute? Look at that. But some mother and daughter matching things there, kitchen tablecloths, fine linens for the dining room, some different hand stitches. It's just really, this was a really fun book. Again, this was one that I kind of, sorry for the camera again. This is another one that I kind of was reading straight on through. A lot of this information is still relevant for today, but yeah, there were some sections on here that were really unique and useful to me, so this one earned a place in my library as well. I don't remember which book I have, but one of my books actually goes into what they call remodeling, which we would call probably today refashioning, I think. And that's where you take existing clothes and you make them into something else. You take maybe a man's shirt and refashion it into something else, or a blouse. I guess they called, they had blouses a lot back in the day. And now that the style has changed, how do you remodel that garment to be more modern? So one of these books has got a really nice refashioning section. I just can't remember which one it is. So that's basically some of my favorites in my mending library. I do have some more books, but those are more for fun. These are the ones that I use because they're relevant and they really bring something to my sewing. I also have a number of books on fitting and alterations and things like that. Again, the best of them are probably in what I already showed you, but I do have some specialized books. So however you want to do your sewing library, I guess the main point of this is don't turn away from the vintage books just because they look old and you think, oh, well, I'm not going to make that kind of dress or that kind of slip cover or whatever. Thumb through that book and see if there's a section in there that explains something really well that you've been wondering about, or you haven't done well, or maybe it's something that you've been afraid to try, or you do it but it doesn't really come out the way you want. Maybe you just want to learn to fit your clothes better. Don't exclude some of these vintage books from your library. And also, that being said, I'm not going to get rid of a few of these modern books either, because the pictures are really good to go along with those vintage books to show you a little bit better some of the things they're talking about. I just don't have as many of these modern ones because I don't really need them. So hopefully that was helpful to you and gave you some additional information and some other ways if you're a new sewer, or maybe you're an experienced sewer and you like to collect some books, or maybe you're just intermediate and you want to up your skill. That's a kind of a tip and a way that you could possibly help yourself to do that. So until next time.